Hello and welcome to Erik Penser Bank. My name is Ludwig Svensson and I'm an equity analyst here at the bank. With me today, I have Matthew Shaulis, who is US President and Chief Commercial Officer of Hansa Biopharma. Welcome, Matt.
Hey, thanks so much, Ludwig. Really appreciate the opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Yeah, likewise. Can you just tell us about your background and role and responsibility at Hansa?
Yeah, sure. Maybe I'll start with background and then tell you a little bit about Hansa. I most recently spent a little over 7 years at Pfizer. I was responsible for the immunology business in Europe and Asia, and previous to that was responsible for oncology in North America. Spent some time earlier in my career in oncology and chronic kidney disease, and also spent a little bit of time in CNS autoimmune diseases when I was at Teva. Here at Hansa, in a role where I'm responsible for commercial on a global basis, including European commercial, and have a couple other responsibilities that are associated with that, things like market access and pricing, but also have responsibility for the cross-functional effort in the United States as well.
Right, perfect. Thank you for that. And can we start off by talking a bit about the European launch dynamics or the conditional approved drug like imlifidase?
Yeah, sure. Happy to talk a little bit about the commercial dynamics in uptake in Europe, and I think it probably is best to say that we really see a substantial opportunity for Idefirix in kidney transplant, but that will come with an S-shaped curve. And by this we mean relatively slow initial uptake, and then in time we'll see some acceleration and more significant growth. And maybe I could start out by just providing a little bit of a reminder about the alternative treatments, and also a little bit about why we see a relatively slow initial uptake as part of that S-shaped curve. And if you'll recall, plasmapheresis is another one of the potential modalities at play here, and it really removes antibodies from circulation. IVIG replaces pathogenic antibodies, and B cell depletion, it lowers antibody levels through, of course, as the namesake says, depletion of B cells. But none of those approaches completely eliminate IgG antibodies in the blood circulation and the tissue. And because of that, they don't have meaningful outcomes in kidney transplantation for highly sensitized patients. They're not considered a standard of care. And from a regulatory standpoint, they're not approved. And as a result, this means that these highly sensitized patients really don't get treated because those modalities don't really offer them a meaningful, sort of consistent outcome. So really what we're doing here is not just launching a product, but we're getting the transplant community to treat a patient type that they don't often treat. Fortunately, Idefirix addresses those limitations. It has a completely IgG-free window that's of a clinically suitable duration. It has outcomes data, including not just engraftment and kidney function, but also survival. And it's also really demonstrated success with regulators as well. In fact, because of the data, it's been approved and is on market in the U.S. So really, the way that we look at commercial uptake, sort of acknowledging that there's going to be this S-shaped curve because we're driving this substantial level of innovation, is around how many centers we can get to adopt the treatment. And we're really pleased to see that recently we've had pretty substantial success. If you look at we were a year ago, we had about 25 clinics that were clinically capable, ready to implement Idefirix into their treatment protocols. today we have over 50. And then also importantly, when you look at the number of centers that have had experience either in a clinical study or in a commercial setting in using Idefirix, a year ago we had only about 10 centers that have had that experience. Today we have over 20 centers. 1 year further down the road that have had this experience in using Idefirix. So we're really looking at key metrics like our ability to get new centers to have experience with the treatment. And of course, it's going to continue to be a slow build because again, the previous treatments that were available to help highly sensitized patients in transplantation didn't offer good outcomes. They weren't recognized by regulatory authorities. And so, we're really driving the uptake of even treating these patients. It's not simply a matter of getting a new product launched that already has established use.
Right. That's helpful. Thank you for that. And you've obviously guided for sales to be back and loaded this year. The Q3 sales ended 50% below the Q2 sales. Can you comment on what happened in the quarter?
Yeah, sure. Happy to offer a little bit of perspective on that. And some of this goes back to our establishment of the overall growth curve for getting more and more centers on board. And of course, as I just detailed, we're really pleased with the success that we've had getting more and more centers using the treatment. However, one of the things that introduces variability or volatility on a monthly or a quarterly basis is organ allocation. So we've got a larger and larger base of accounts or clinics that are able and ready to use Idefirix. They've got patients that are on their wait lists that are just awaiting allocation of an organ. And then when an organ is allocated, that organ has to be accepted, right? Idefirix allows us to remove many of the antibodies that would be a challenge, but the organ still has to be acceptable for that patient across a whole host of factors. So essentially what we see in some months and some quarters is a high level of volatility related to the allocation of the organs. So even though we've got a larger base of centers who have patients on their wait list ready for the treatment, we don't always see the organs get allocated in sort of a consistent pattern over time. So this is some of what was a driver in the third quarter of what we thought were sales that we found frustrating and we're impatient and want to see larger sales on a quarter by quarter basis. But we also know that we're going to need to continue to deal with these levels of variability in organ allocation. So we're feeling quite good about fourth quarter. Sometimes there's organ allocation that is relatively low. Sometimes it's a little bit more robust, and I think the early signs are that fourth quarter should be substantially larger than third quarter was. So I hope that addresses the question, and I just want to be clear too that we're always at risk of having a month or a quarter that is just subject to this level of variability related to organ allocation.
Absolutely, that's very interesting to hear. Can you also talk about the importance of the new Eurotransplant pilot program, which was launched during the summer, and when is this expected to sort of contribute to sales?
Yeah, so the Eurotransplant program is really exciting. It is an acknowledgement from Eurotransplant and the overall treatment community within those member states that include the Netherlands, Luxembourg, Austria, Croatia, Hungary, Slovenia, Germany, Belgium, that there is an opportunity here for the highly sensitized patient. And because of that acknowledgement, they've essentially put in place a protocol. They have had previously something called the Acceptable Mismatch Program, which had patients with a minimal wait time of 3 years on the wait list and donors below age 65 that were in place to try to get organs to patients that had an acceptable level of mismatch. This is a carve out and a specific program for highly sensitized patients. And we're really encouraged that they just started the program in the third quarter. And of course, that required that they start to take a look at the patients on their wait lists and identify them. And they've found over 150 eligible patients. It's important to note that they did start with the patients that had been on the wait list the longest. So in many cases, patients well over 3 years on the wait list. And from that sort of larger group, they started to take a look at an initial group that was a little over 20 in number. And from that, they began to reach out to the treatment centers where these patients are on the wait list, review much more specific clinical characteristics of these patients, and now they're in a position where they've identified a number of these patients for treatment, and will now wait for their organ allocation to take place. I think one of the encouraging things about Eurotransplant is that this protocol not only is in that large footprint of countries that represent about 137 million in population, but the allocation of organs to the acceptable mismatch and the highly sensitized programs would take place before they allocate organs, more broadly in in the rest of the organ allocation network. So we're encouraged that we should see some of those patients that were prioritized based on that initial review of 20 patients get treatment sometime soon.
Great. Yeah, thank you for that answer. And what makes you believe in an accelerated future sales, and what are the metrics for investors to track the underlying progress?
Yeah, great question. And I think it goes back to those fundamental dynamics about this opportunity. Really, we believe that we will get to a point of acceleration, although it's going to be gradual. The acceleration that'll happen in this S-shaped curve, we think will be a little bit later. We think we'll probably see more significant growth sometime next year. But the metrics that matter most are things like market access. And we've secured market access in 13 countries in Europe. It's substantial growth over where we were previously. We continue to be successful in HTA processes, including in 10 countries that have had them. We are seeing significant patient identification opportunities. And then, as I said, most importantly, it's the number of centers, not only that are clinically ready to use the product, but that have had experience with it. And we expect to report back each quarter that will continue to grow the number of centers that have experience using Idefirix. And again, we're really encouraged that a year ago, that was 10 centers. Today, that's over 20. And we know that the centers that have experience are going to be the leading indicator for us continuing to grow sales.
Right. And do you have any update on your post-approval study that you're conducting in Europe, and maybe how this is impacting the commercial sales?
Yeah, happy to comment on that. And of course, we do know that the post-approval study is clearly an area where we want to fulfill a regulatory requirement, and as such, we're working to complete the enrollment in that population by the end of 2025. And with that, we also know that will entail having patients enroll into that study that would probably otherwise receive Idefirix in a commercial setting. So we're pleased with the uptake of the program. We think that it's tracking, but of course that does mean that many of those patients that go into that regulatory study are not going to be treated commercially. And of course, we think it's critical to generate this data. We also recognize that other markets like the US later probably will not have this dynamic, where when we get a label for the product, we're still working through a regulatory study that potentially is taking patients that would otherwise be treated commercially.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And speaking of the US market, the Confidis trial that you're currently conducting, you have revised your guidance on the timeline here, and with a BLA to be filed in 2025. What are the reasons for this delay, and what have you done to mitigate this?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ludwig, and just wanted to maybe clarify a couple key points about this. First of all, we think the U.S. is a really important market. We think there's approximately 2,500 highly sensitized patients in the U.S. that have an appropriate CPRA score for ultimately, candidacy for Idefirix. And we also think that some of those fundamental dynamics that I explained a little bit earlier about organ allocation are probably at play here as well. We're really pleased that when we look at some of the key metrics associated with Confidis, we've seen the study actually get a little bit faster. So, for example, when we compare year-to-date October 23 versus the full year of 22, the Confidis study has actually included about 30% higher consented patients. It has about 60% higher patients that are consented and waiting for an organ allocation. And it has about 20% higher patients that have randomized. Again, that's October year to date 23 versus a full year of 22. So while the study has gotten a little bit quicker in some of these key metrics, we also know that it remains subject to organ allocation. And in this case, we know that patients that are on the study that are ready to get treatment oftentimes are just waiting for that organ to get allocated. And then we've also done some things to accelerate the study despite that factor. So first of all, we've decided that we're going to increase the number of study sites from 20 up to about 25. And this means that we're going to be adding an additional 9 sites to the study. And of course, they're going to be geographically dispersed all over the US in order to cover some of the key population centers. Secondly, we've implemented a protocol amendment that will allow a greater proportion of waiting recipients to be allocated and accept organs. What we do is achieve this by a degree of antibody and antigen delisting that would otherwise preclude the organ allocation and its acceptance. And then finally, we've made some operational improvements in the study, things that will make it more straightforward and well understood for the study sites to identify suitable patients, providing more guidance on how to implement the treatment within clinical protocols, within centers, and then also a process that we think is going to allow us to convert study centers from initial identification into site activation a little bit faster. So we think all of those things are going to be important drivers for the study. We will ultimately randomize 64 highly sensitized patients into the study. Today, we sit at 87 patients that are enrolled, and a little over half of the patients randomized relative to that target. So we believe that all of this will put us in a position to conclude the study sometime in mid-24, and then we'll target submission of the BLA towards the end of 25, as per some of our original guidance.
Great. And if we talk about the commercialization here in these markets, do you believe the uptake will be different in the US compared to Europe?
Yeah, maybe I could explain some of the differences in the market dynamics there. And let me start by saying that one thing that will be sort of consistent and fundamental will be an S-shaped uptake curve, right? We still have a fundamental dynamic in the US where, the other treatment alternatives are not considered a standard of care, don't have substantial outcomes data, and don't have regulatory approval. So we are starting from a similar place where we're implementing a paradigm shift and really treating a group of patients that have been underserved in the past. So that will mean a slower uptake that later accelerates as we get more and more centers on board. But there are going to be some notable differences that we think will make the US a little bit faster than Europe. We just talked a little bit earlier about how in Europe we have a post-approval commitment study that's ongoing. And this is because the EMA approval of Idefirix in Europe was on the basis of phase 2 programs in just 2 study centers in Europe. And with that, it means that there are not a substantial set of transplant centers in Europe that already had experience with Idefirix treatment due to clinical trial activity when we launched. So that'll be very different in the US. We will have 25 centers in the US that already have experience with Idefirix at the time that we get the regulatory approval. So that alone will be a substantial improvement in having a larger base of centers that know how to identify patients, have already had experience in using Idefirix in their protocols, and already have an established relationship with the company. And of course, we'll be able to support them. So that's a significant advantage. I think there's a number of other things that we're able to do before the time of the launch that, frankly, in Europe, we're now doing after the time of the launch. That includes things like engaging with the centers, with our medical teams, which we're doing, currently as we support the clinical trial, and then also working with medical societies on things like medical education and guidelines. These are all things that we're able to do, as I said, well before the time of the launch, and that have only been done after the time of the launch in Europe. Now, I think one of the other significant differences is that we're really pleased with the way that we've achieved reimbursement and access, and had health technology assessments that are successful in Europe. But this has all happened, after the product was approved by and large. In the US, that'll be different. We'll have opportunities for pre-approval information exchange with the public and private payers in the US in advance of the launch. And we'll even be able to engage with them in things like contracting discussions that happen before and at the time of the launch of the product. So I think that that's going to be a really substantial set of differences between the US market and the European market. And therefore, we're encouraged that we think that while it will be an S-shaped curve, things will progress a little bit more rapidly in the US.
Great. Thank you for that, Matt. And I actually have one last question regarding the long-term data that you received, where you saw a 90% patient survival and 82% graft survival after 5 years. Can you tell us a little bit how this compares to a sort of normal transplantation?
Yeah. So one thing that we're really encouraged about, Ludwig, is that that this type of sort of outcomes metrics, 90% survival, EGFR, around 50. These are all right in line with what you would expect with the normal transplantation population. So essentially, with the use of Idefirix, patients that would otherwise very likely not be transplanted are able to receive a transplant. Because of this, they're no longer on dialysis, Their overall quality of life is substantially improved because of that. The payer is relieved of the costs of their treatment on dialysis, and the outcomes that they're getting are consistent with outcomes for patients that are not highly sensitized and that don't have this antibody and antigen challenge that these highly sensitized patients do. So we had seen some of this data at a 3-year time frame, and we're very encouraged by it. And now to see it at a 5-year time frame shows that this is a very, very durable outcome, one that we're really pleased for patients. And we think that the clinicians who again have had these other alternatives that really don't achieve strong outcomes and don't have regulatory approval, have not been treating these patients, are also going to look very favorably upon this 5-year set of data. And of course, something that shows, survival is always very compelling.
Great. Thank you for that, Matt. Pleasure speaking with you, and I wish you good luck going forward.
Hey, thanks so much, Ludwig. Really appreciate the opportunity to have the conversation, and look forward to future engagements with you at some point down the road.
Yeah, great. Take care.
You too. Bye-bye.